rifle shot cracked through the desert silence like thunder breaking stone, and Samuel Porter knew with absolute certainty that in the next 30 seconds, either his family would be dead or something impossible would happen. His 8-year-old daughter Emma sat behind him in the wagon, humming a hymn their grandmother had taught her, completely unaware that 12 Apache warriors had just appeared on the ridge above them, like ghosts born from red rock and shadow. But what that little girl held in her tiny hands, a piece of bread no bigger than a man's palm, would soon stop those warriors cold and change the course of two people's destinies forever. The morning sun hammered down on the alkali flats east of Tucson like God's own anvil, beating the earth into submission. Samuel Porter guided his weather-beaten prairie schooner through Devil's Canyon, that narrow gash in the earth, where more men had died than anyone cared to count. The leather reins bit into his calloused palms, slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. Beside him, his wife Margaret sat rigid as a fence post, her knuckles bone white where she gripped the shotgun across her lap. She hadn't loaded it. They both knew that would be seen as provocation, but her finger hovered near the trigger guard like a prayer waiting to be spoken. Behind them in the wagon bed, Emma played with her corn-husk doll, singing that same hymn in her sweet, clear voice that carried through the canyon like birdsong in a graveyard. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The words floated up to the canyon walls and seemed to hang there, suspended in the shimmering heat. The child had no notion that they were trespassing through Apache hunting grounds, territory that had been contested and blood-soaked since before she was born. To her 8-year-old mind, this was simply another day of their long journey west, another adventure in the grand story her father had promised would end with green valleys and fresh starts. Samuel's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the rimrock above them, where shadows could hide death and every boulder might conceal an arrow already nocked and drawn. This was the killing ground, the place where the boundary between white settlement and tribal territory blurred, like heat mirages rising from sun-baked stone. Every man who'd traveled this route knew the stories, whispered around campfires and in saloons, about wagons that entered Devil's Canyon, full of hope, and emerged as burnt husks, their occupants never found, their dreams scattered to the desert wind like so much dust. The canyon walls pressed in on both sides, red sandstone carved by ancient waters into shapes that looked like watching faces, accusing fingers, open mouths frozen in eternal screams. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned over the rocky trail, each sound seeming to echo forever in the narrow space. Samuel could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal, desperate for escape. 20 years of frontier living had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body was screaming danger. "Papa, I'm hungry." Emma's voice cut through his dark thoughts like sunlight through storm clouds. The innocence in those two simple words made his chest tighten. How could he explain to her that they were down to their last provisions, that the settlement they'd hoped to reach yesterday was still 2 days away, that giving her food now might mean starving before they reached safety? Margaret reached back into their meager supplies without looking, her movements mechanical, practiced. Her fingers found the last heel of bread, hard as a cavalry boot and about as appetizing. It was all they had left besides some salt pork that had gone rancid in the heat and a handful of beans they were saving for absolute desperation. She passed it to Emma with forced cheerfulness. "Make it last, sweetheart. Small bites, like we talked about." Emma took the bread with both hands, treating it like the treasure it was. At 8 years old, she'd already learned the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, that food was currency, that hunger was a constant companion, that waste was a sin greater than any the preacher talked about. She broke off a tiny piece, no bigger than a button, and placed it on her tongue, letting it soften slowly, while she continued to hum her grandmother's hymn. That's when Samuel saw them. First, just a flicker of movement on the northern rim, so slight he might have imagined it. Then another on the south side, and another, until the shadows themselves seemed to come alive. Warriors on horseback materialized from the rock face, as if the canyon had given birth to them. One moment the ridgeline was empty. The next it bristled with Apache fighters, their faces painted for war, their rifles catching the sunlight like signal mirrors sending messages of death. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the Winchester propped against his leg, but he forced himself to stop. Any sudden movement now would be like striking a match in a powder magazine. He could feel Margaret's body tense beside him, could hear her breathing go shallow and quick like a rabbit sensing a coyote. But she didn't reach for the shotgun, didn't scream, didn't do anything that might trigger the avalanche of violence hanging above them. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat like a living thing. "Stay calm. Keep Emma close. Don't look them in the eye." The warriors began their descent, their ponies picking their way down the treacherous slope with the sure-footed grace of mountain goats. They moved in perfect coordination, a choreography of death rehearsed through generations of conflict. As they drew closer, Samuel could make out details that made his blood run cold. The black and white war paint that meant no quarter would be given, the scalps hanging from their belts, the practiced ease with which they held their weapons. The lead warrior was a man who carried authority in every line of his body, from the straight set of his shoulders to the way his horse responded to the slightest shift of his weight. This was Chief Standing Wolf. Though Samuel didn't know his name, wouldn't have recognized it if he had. The chief's face was a map of battles fought and won, each scar a story, each line earned through leadership in desperate times. His eyes were black as obsidian and just as sharp, missing nothing, judging everything. Behind him rode Swift Arrow, younger and burning with the kind of rage that only comes from fresh grief. The young warrior's brother had been killed by white settlers not 3 weeks past, shot in the back while trying to trade pelts at what was supposed to be a neutral post. His hand rested on his tomahawk, fingers drumming against the handle in a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. He studied the Porter family with undisguised hatred, seeing in them every white face that had brought suffering to his people. The warriors formed a perfect circle around the wagon, their horses snorting and stamping, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a curtain between life and death. Samuel counted them quickly. 12 warriors, all armed, all clearly experienced in the art of killing. He'd been in the cavalry during the war, had seen what determined fighters could do when they had the advantage of position and numbers. The math was simple and brutal. His family had no chance if this turned violent. Chief Standing Wolf raised his hand, and the silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the earth. His dark eyes moved slowly from Samuel to Margaret, studying their faces with the intensity of a man reading sign on a difficult trail. Then his gaze settled on the small figure in the back of the wagon, and something in his expression shifted, became more complex. Emma looked up at him with the fearless curiosity that belonged only to children who hadn't yet learned that the world contained monsters. She still held her piece of bread in one small hand, her doll in the other. To her innocent eyes, these were simply men she hadn't met before, perhaps a bit scary with their painted faces, but still just people. The concept that they might hurt her or her parents was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. What Chief Standing Wolf saw in that moment stopped his thoughts cold as winter river water. The child looked at him without fear, without hatred, without the calculating wariness he'd seen in every white face for 20 years. She looked at him the way his own daughter, Mourning Dove, used to look at strangers, with simple curiosity and an openness that assumed the best in people until proven otherwise. Mourning Dove had been dead for 3 winters now, taken by the white man's pox that had swept through their camp like wildfire through dry grass. She'd been about this white child's age when the sickness took her. And in her final fevered hours, she'd still tried to share her water with the other sick children, still tried to help despite her own suffering. The memory hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his face impassive, revealing nothing. Swift Arrow shifted restlessly on his pony, interpreting his chief's silence as hesitation, weakness perhaps. The young warrior's patience, never his strongest quality, was fraying like rope under too much strain. He spoke in Apache, his words sharp and accusatory. "Why do we wait? They are trespassers. The law is clear. Take their goods and leave them to the desert." The other warriors murmured agreement, their horses sensing the tension and growing restless. Gray Mountain, an elder warrior who'd ridden with Standing Wolf for 20 winters, watched his chief carefully. He'd seen that look in Standing Wolf's eyes only once before, years ago when they'd found a Mexican child wandering alone in the desert, half dead from thirst. The chief had insisted on taking the child to the nearest mission, despite the danger, despite the protests of his warriors. Chief Standing Wolf finally spoke, first in Apache to his men, then in the broken English he'd learned through years of failed treaties and bitter negotiations. "You cross sacred hunting ground. This land belong Apache. You pay for passage, or—" He let the threat hang in the air, like a blade suspended by a thread. Samuel's throat felt dry as sand. "We don't mean any harm. We're just passing through, heading to meet other families near Prescott. We have little of value, but—" "All," the chief interrupted. "All supplies, all horses. You walk from here." Margaret gasped, a sound escaping before she could stop it. Walking through this hostile territory without supplies or transportation would be nothing short of a death sentence. The desert didn't forgive, didn't show mercy. It would kill them as surely as any bullet, just more slowly, more cruelly. "Please," Samuel said, his voice cracking despite his effort to remain strong. "We have a child. She won't survive 2 days in this heat, without water, without shade. Surely—" "Not Apache problem," Chief Standing Wolf said. But even as the words left his mouth, his eyes drifted back to Emma. She had stopped humming now, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its cause. She looked from face to painted face, her expression serious, thoughtful. Swift Arrow dismounted, eager to begin confiscating the settlers' goods. This was justice. This was the price for all the Apache blood spilled, all the land stolen, all the promises broken like dry twigs underfoot. He strode toward the wagon with purpose, his hand reaching for the supply sacks. That's when Emma did something that would be spoken of around Apache campfires for generations to come. She stood up in the wagon bed, her small figure straightening with the kind of dignity that doesn't know it's dignified. Looking directly at Chief Standing Wolf, she held out her piece of bread, that last precious piece of bread that was all the food she had in the world. "You can have my bread if you're hungry," she said, her voice clear as a mission bell in the desert silence. "Mama says sharing makes everything better." The words hit the assembled warriors like a physical force. Swift Arrow stopped mid-stride, his mouth falling open. Gray Mountain felt his throat tighten with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Even the horses seemed to sense that something unprecedented had just occurred, their restless movements stilling. Chief Standing Wolf stared at the offered bread as if it were some impossible artifact from another world. In 30 years of conflict with white settlers, he had been shot at, lied to, cheated, and betrayed more times than he could count. He had been offered bribes, threats, and hollow promises. But never, not once, had anyone offered him kindness without expectation of return. Never had a white child looked at him and seen simply a hungry man who might need food. The bread trembled slightly in Emma's outstretched hand, but she didn't lower it. Her blue eyes never wavered from the chief's painted face. In her innocent mind, the equation was simple. Here was someone who might be hungry. She had food, therefore she should share. The complex history of warfare and hatred between their peoples didn't exist for her. There was only this moment, this chance to do what her parents had taught her was right. Chief Standing Wolf dismounted, slowly. Each movement deliberate, considered. The other warriors watched in stunned silence as their leader approached the wagon. Swift Arrow's hand went to his tomahawk, not to threaten the settlers, but in confusion, perhaps even fear at this unprecedented breach of protocol. Step by careful step, the chief approached Emma. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back, just kept holding out that small piece of bread with the patience of a saint. When he was close enough to see the trust in her eyes, close enough to smell the innocence that clung to her like morning dew, something inside his chest cracked, like ice breaking on a frozen river. With movements as gentle as if he were approaching a butterfly, Chief Standing Wolf reached out and took the bread from Emma's small hand. The moment his weathered fingers closed around it, the world seemed to shift on its axis. This wasn't tribute or payment or bribe. This was a gift freely given, an act of pure generosity, from someone who had nothing to someone who, in her child's understanding, had even less. He brought the bread to his mouth and took a small bite, chewing slowly, letting the stale, nearly tasteless morsel rest on his tongue. But it wasn't the bread he was tasting. It was the memory of Mourning Dove offering her last sip of water to a dying bird, the echo of a time when kindness didn't need to check the color of skin before expressing itself. "No!" Swift Arrow's voice shattered the moment like a rock through glass. He spoke in rapid Apache, his words tumbling over each other in his fury. "Have you forgotten what they did to my brother? To all our brothers? You take their poisoned gift while our children starve?" The young warrior raised his tomahawk, not toward the settlers, but toward the sky, as if appealing to the spirits themselves to witness this betrayal. "She tricks you with a child's face. It's another white lie, another deception." Chief Standing Wolf turned slowly to face Swift Arrow, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains.
"I have buried wives and children, brothers and fathers. I have seen our land taken, our buffalo slaughtered, our sacred places defiled. Do not speak to me of what I have forgotten."
He held up the small piece of bread, now with a tiny bite missing. "But I also remember what we were before the hatred. I remember when Apache children shared food with strangers, because it was right. This white child shows us who we were, who we could be again." Gray Mountain dismounted, moving to stand beside his chief. The old warrior's face was carved from years of sun and wind and war, but his eyes were soft as he looked at Emma. "The child speaks truth without knowing it," he said in Apache. "Sometimes the spirits choose innocent mouths to remind us of forgotten wisdoms." But Swift Arrow's rage had been building for too long, fed by too much grief to be cooled by philosophy. "Then you are both fools." He turned to the other warriors seeking support. "Will we let them pass because a child gave us scraps? Will we betray our dead for breadcrumbs?" The warrior band was fracturing. Samuel could see it, even without understanding their words. Some faces showed agreement with Swift Arrow's anger, hands tightening on weapons. Others looked at Emma with something approaching wonder, seeing perhaps their own children in her fearless generosity. That's when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Many horses, riding hard. Over the southern ridge came another group of riders, and Samuel's heart sank as he recognized their leader, Jake Harlan, a man whose reputation for Indian killing was legend throughout the territory. Harlan and his boys didn't distinguish between hostile and peaceful tribes, didn't care about treaties or truces. To them, the only good Apache was a dead Apache, and they'd made a blood sport of proving it. "Well, well, well," Harlan called out as he surveyed the scene, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he started. "Looks like we arrived just in time for a turkey shoot." The 15 men with him spread out along the ridge, rifles already aimed at the Apache warriors below. They had the high ground, superior numbers, and the element of surprise. In seconds, the canyon could become a slaughterhouse. But then Chief Standing Wolf did something that nobody, not Swift Arrow, not Harlan, not even Samuel, expected. He stepped in front of the Porter wagon, placing his body between Harlan's guns and the settler family. "These people, under Apache protection," he announced, his English suddenly clear and strong. "Any man shoots answers to me." Harlan's face went through several colors before settling on a dangerous purple. "Have you lost your mind, Porter? You're letting these savages protect you?" Samuel found his voice, strengthened by the chief's unexpected courage. "These men have shown more honor in the last hour than you've shown in your lifetime, Harlan." Margaret stood up beside her husband, her chin raised in defiance. "They could have killed us 20 times over. Instead, they accepted my daughter's kindness. That makes them better men than you'll ever be." Swift Arrow watched this exchange with dawning understanding. These new whites were everything he hated, cruel, bloodthirsty, without honor. But the family in the wagon, they were different. The child especially, but the parents too, choosing to stand with Apache warriors against their own kind. The young warrior moved his horse to stand beside Chief Standing Wolf. "The child taught us something," he said in English, wanting everyone to understand. "These others, they teach us too. They show us what we refuse to become." Gray Mountain and the other warriors formed up, creating a protective wall around the wagon. The message was clear. To get to the Porter family, Harlan would have to go through the Apache warriors. Harlan's men shifted nervously. Fighting outnumbered Apache in the open was one thing. Fighting them in their own territory, in a narrow canyon where their knowledge of every rock and shadow gave them the advantage, was something else entirely. And there was something else, something unsettling about the scene. Apache warriors protecting a white family. It violated everything they thought they knew about the world. "This ain't over," Harlan snarled, but he was already wheeling his horse around. "You've chosen your side, Porter. You'll regret it." The threat echoed off the canyon walls as Harlan and his men retreated, their horses' hooves throwing up dust that hung in the air like a banner of retreat. When the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded, Chief Standing Wolf turned back to the Porter family. Emma was still standing in the wagon, her face bright with a smile that seemed to light up the canyon. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew that somehow sharing her bread had made things better. Just like Mama always said it would. "You may pass safely through Apache land," Chief Standing Wolf said formally. "No warrior will harm you." He paused, looking at Emma with eyes that held depths of pain and wonder. "Your daughter has reminded us of something we had forgotten. That enemies are made, not born." Swift Arrow dismounted and approached the wagon. The rage that had consumed him earlier had transformed into something more complex. Not quite peace, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, carved wooden horse, something he'd been making for his nephew. "For the child," he said, offering it to Emma. "She has brave heart. Brave heart should have brave horse." Emma's face lit up with pure joy as she accepted the gift, clutching it to her chest alongside her cornhusk doll. "Thank you," she said, then looked at her mother. "Mama, can I give him something too?" Margaret's eyes were bright with tears as she nodded. Emma dug into her small bag and pulled out a blue ribbon, one of her few possessions. She held it out to Swift Arrow, with the same generosity she'd shown with the bread.
The young warrior took it solemnly, tying it around his wrist like a talisman. In that moment, the cycle of gift-giving sealed something between them. A bridge built from children's toys and ribbons that somehow spanned a chasm of blood and sorrow. Gray Mountain approached Samuel, his weathered face serious.
"You teach your daughter well. She has old soul, wise soul. Not many would share last food with enemy."
"We didn't teach her to see enemies," Samuel replied. "We taught her to see people." The old warrior nodded slowly.
"Perhaps that is wisdom we all need to remember." Chief Standing Wolf looked once more at the piece of bread in his hand, now missing the small bite he'd taken. Such a small thing to have changed so much, to have prevented what could have been a massacre, to have turned enemies into protectors.
"When you reach your people," he said to Samuel, "tell them what happened here. Tell them Apache no difference between those who come with war in their hearts and those who come with bread to share. Tell them child's kindness can be stronger than warrior's rage." As the Porter wagon began to roll forward, the Apache warriors parted to let them pass. Emma waved enthusiastically at each warrior, clutching her new wooden horse. Several of them raised their hands in return, something that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. But Chief Standing Wolf had one more thing to say. He rode alongside the wagon for a moment, his eyes on Samuel and Margaret. "Your daughter, she has medicine. Not medicine of herbs and ceremonies, but medicine of the heart. Guard her well. World needs such medicine." Margaret reached out impulsively and touched the chief's hand where it rested on his horse's neck. "Your daughter would be proud of you," she said softly, "for choosing kindness over revenge." The chief's composure finally cracked, and for just a moment, Samuel saw the grieving father beneath the warrior's paint. "Mourning Dove, that was her name. She was like your Emma. She would have given her last breath to help stranger." He straightened, recovering his dignity. "Today, your daughter helped me remember her true way, not through anger, but through grace." As the wagon rolled on, Swift Arrow called out, "Porter family, always welcome in Apache land. You are under our protection. Any who harm you, harm us." The warriors remained in formation until the wagon rounded the bend, disappearing from sight. Then, one by one, they began to disperse, returning to their patrol of the hunting grounds. But something had changed in them, something fundamental that would ripple out through their people, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Swift Arrow rode up beside Chief Standing Wolf as they headed back to camp. "My brother," he said quietly. "He would not understand what happened today." "No," the chief agreed, "but perhaps his children will. Perhaps that is enough." Gray Mountain joined them, his ancient eyes thoughtful. "The whites will not believe Porter's story. They will say he lies or was bewitched." "Some will," Chief Standing Wolf acknowledged. "But seeds of truth, once planted, have way of growing even in hostile soil, and the child, she will remember. She will tell her children, and they will tell theirs. Stories have power across generations." As they rode toward their camp, Chief Standing Wolf looked once more at the piece of bread, now wrapped carefully in leather to preserve it. He would keep it, not as food, but as reminder. A reminder that hatred was not the only path, that even in the darkest times, a child's innocence could illuminate another way. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead, the Porter family continued their journey, carrying with them a story that would be told and retold, growing with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. That on one desperate morning in Devil's Canyon, a little girl's simple act of sharing had prevented bloodshed and built a bridge where everyone believed
only walls could stand. The Apache warriors disappeared into the landscape as completely as they had appeared. But the echo of what had transpired lingered in the canyon, like a prayer finally answered. In years to come, travelers would speak of Devil's Canyon as a place where miracles were possible, where the impossible became real, where bread freely given could transform warriors' hearts and turn enemies into protectors. Chief Standing Wolf would live another 10 winters, long enough to see the war's end, the treaties signed, the reservation boundaries drawn. But he would never forget the white child who had looked at him without fear and offered him her last piece of bread. In the darkest moments, when bitterness threatened to consume him, he would remember Emma Porter's innocent generosity and find again the strength to choose grace over vengeance. Swift Arrow would become a great leader of his people, known for his ability to find common ground with white settlers when others saw only conflict. He would wear that blue ribbon until it fell apart from age, then keep the fragments in his medicine bundle. When asked why he trusted certain whites when others didn't, he would tell the story of a little girl and a piece of bread. And Emma Porter? She would grow up to become a teacher, working on the very reservation where Chief Standing Wolf's people were forced to settle. She would teach Apache children alongside white children, revolutionary for her time. When people asked her why she wasn't afraid, why she trusted so easily across the racial divide, she would tell them about a morning in Devil's Canyon when Apache warriors protected her family because she shared her bread. The story would spread, as such stories do, changing with each telling but maintaining its essential truth, that kindness transcends boundaries, that innocence can teach wisdom to warriors, that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the power to change the world. In a frontier torn apart by violence and mistrust, it became a legend of hope, proof that another way was possible. As the last light faded from Devil's Canyon that day, it seemed the very rocks had absorbed something of what had transpired. Travelers in years to come would speak of feeling a strange peace in that narrow passage, as if the land itself remembered and honored the moment when a child's generosity had turned warriors into protectors, enemies into friends, and hatred into understanding. The bread was gone, consumed or crumbled to dust, but what it had represented, the possibility of grace in a graceless world, lived on. And in the American West, where legends were born from smaller seeds than this, the story of Emma Porter and Chief Standing Wolf became immortal, a tale told around campfires and in saloons, in Apache wiki-ups and settlers' cabins, wherever people needed reminding that humanity's better angels could prevail, even in the darkest of times.